The zipper of my tent slowly dragged itself open at exactly 3:14 in the morning. I remember staring into the darkness outside, while freezing rain hammered against the trees surrounding my campsite, high in the Appalachian Mountains. What terrified me most was the whisper that came from somewhere beyond the fire pit, because the voice sounded exactly like my dead brother asking me to come outside. I grabbed my flashlight with shaking hands and crawled out into the freezing mountain air. The forest was completely silent, except for distant thunder rolling through the valleys beneath the cliffs. My flashlight beam swept across the campsite until it landed on muddy, barefoot footprints, circling my tent in perfect circles. The tracks stopped inches away from where I stood, breathing in panic. They looked fresh, even though the rain should have washed them away long ago. When I raised my light toward the trees, I saw someone standing between the pines, watching me without moving. The figure vanished the second lightning illuminated the forest around me. I stumbled backward and nearly fell into the remains of my dying fire while trying to focus my light into the darkness. Then the whisper returned from deeper within the woods, and this time it sounded much closer than before. "Ethan, help me." My brother had been dead for 7 months. His body was never recovered after he disappeared during a climbing trip in Colorado. Hearing his voice in those mountains shattered something inside me, because part of me genuinely believed he might somehow still be alive. I should have packed my gear and left immediately that night. Instead, grief convinced me to follow the voice deeper into the Appalachian wilderness, where no sane person should ever travel alone. Looking back now, I realized the mountain wanted me to hear him. The truth is that I came to Appalachia because I was desperate to escape my life after Ethan disappeared. I had spent months trapped inside my apartment, replaying our final phone call over and over until I could barely sleep anymore. When I finally snapped, I loaded my truck with camping gear and drove 12 hours toward the mountains without telling anyone where I was going. The small town near the trailhead looked abandoned when I arrived just before sunset. Rusted trucks lined empty streets, while thick fog drifted between old wooden buildings that leaned sideways with age. I stopped inside a tiny gas station, where the cashier stared at me the moment I mentioned camping alone in the mountains. The old man behind the counter asked where I planned to hike before slowly shaking his head. He warned me that several hikers had disappeared over the past 2 years along the same trails I intended to explore. When I laughed nervously and assumed he meant animal attacks, his expression somehow became even more serious. "They never find bodies," he whispered quietly. The man told me locals avoided certain areas after dark because strange voices echoed through the forest at night. Some people claimed the mountains copied familiar voices to lure travelers away from marked trails. Before I left, he handed me an old hunting knife and told me not to trust anything I heard after midnight. I thought he was trying to scare tourists with local legends. The Appalachian Mountains are filled with ghost stories and missing person myths that spread through isolated towns like wildfire. At the time, I believed grief had simply made me vulnerable to creepy stories and mountain paranoia. The deeper I traveled into the forest the following morning, the stranger everything became. I noticed old wooden symbols hanging from branches tied together with black string and animal bones. Every few miles, I passed abandoned campsites that looked as though people had left suddenly in the middle of the night. One campsite contained a cold fire pit surrounded by children's toys covered in dirt and leaves. Another had a sleeping bag sliced open from top to bottom, as though someone had crawled violently out of it. I kept telling myself there had to be logical explanations, but the feeling of being watched never disappeared. That second night changed everything forever. I woke to the sound of footsteps crunching slowly around my tent, while someone hummed a song my mother used to sing to Ethan and me as children. The voice outside sounded exactly like my mother, despite the fact she was hundreds of miles away back home. I froze completely while listening to the footsteps circle closer through the darkness. Something brushed lightly against the side of my tent before stopping directly beside my head. Then my mother's voice whispered softly through the fabric, asking me why I abandoned Ethan in the mountains. I burst outside holding the hunting knife, but the campsite was empty once again. My flashlight revealed dozens of barefoot footprints surrounding my tent in wet mud. That was when I noticed another set of tracks leading away into the forest toward a steep ravine hidden behind thick trees. Against every instinct telling me to run, I followed them. The tracks led me to an old ranger station partially collapsed into the mountainside. Most of the windows were shattered, and the wooden walls looked blackened by fire damage from decades earlier. Inside the ruined station, I discovered mold-covered journals scattered across a dusty desk beneath layers of dead insects. The journal entries belonged to a park ranger named Walter Griggs from 1987. His writings described campers hearing voices from underground tunnels hidden throughout the Appalachian Mountains. According to the entries, people who followed the voices were never seen again, except for occasional reports of human screams echoing beneath the earth at night. One page contained a sentence written repeatedly across the paper in frantic handwriting. It learns your grief before it calls your name. Reading those words made my stomach twist, because the thing outside my tent had known exactly how to reach me. At that point, I genuinely didn't know what to do. If you had discovered what I found that night, would you have kept investigating or walked away forever? Let me know what you think before I tell you what happened next. Instead of leaving, I made the worst decision of my life by searching deeper around the ranger station. Hidden beneath broken floorboards, I uncovered a narrow tunnel descending into complete darkness below the mountain. Cold air drifted upward, carrying a terrible smell that reminded me of wet soil mixed with rotting meat. I should never have entered that tunnel alone. Every survival instinct inside me screamed to turn around while I climbed downward, using only my flashlight for guidance. The walls became strangely smooth, deeper underground, as though something massive had carved them intentionally over centuries. Then I started hearing voices all around me in the darkness below. Some cried for help while others screamed in terror before suddenly cutting off mid-sentence. Among them, I heard Ethan calling my name again from somewhere deeper beneath the mountain. The tunnel eventually opened into an enormous underground chamber, hidden beneath Appalachia. My flashlight illuminated hundreds of old backpacks, tents, shoes, and human bones scattered across the cavern floor like trophies. Hanging from the ceiling were crude symbols painted in dried blood across the rock walls. That was when I realized the whispers were coming from directly behind me. I turned slowly and saw what looked like a person standing at the edge of my flashlight beam. At first glance, it resembled Ethan perfectly right down to the scar above his eyebrow from childhood. Then the thing smiled too wide. Its jaw stretched unnaturally open while the skin around its face twitched like something struggling to imitate human expressions correctly. The creature's eyes were completely black, and its limbs bent at impossible angles beneath torn clothing stained with mud and blood. When it spoke again, dozens of different voices emerged together from its mouth. I stumbled backward in horror while the creature crawled toward me across the cave floor. The sounds it produced shifted rapidly between crying children, terrified hikers, and familiar voices from my own memories. It was not simply mimicking people, because somehow it carried fragments of everyone it had taken. Then I saw Ethan among the bodies hanging deeper within the cavern. His corpse looked partially preserved by the cold underground air, but his face remained frozen in absolute terror. The realization shattered me because it meant the thing before me had been using his voice for months. Every whisper I heard in the forest came from the creature wearing stolen memories like bait. The entity lunged toward me with horrifying speed, while shrieking through dozens of human voices at once. I barely escaped by knocking over an old lantern near the tunnel entrance, igniting parts of the chamber in flames. The creature screamed from the darkness behind me, while I climbed desperately back toward the surface. I could hear it chasing me through the tunnels the entire way. Its limbs scraped violently against stone walls, while familiar voices begged me to stop running. At one point, it even used my own voice, screaming for help somewhere ahead in the darkness. I emerged from the tunnel just before sunrise and ran through the forest without stopping. Branches tore through my clothes, while distant screams echoed beneath the mountains behind me. I abandoned nearly all my camping gear and reached my truck covered in blood, mud, and scratches hours later. When I returned to town, the gas station was completely empty. Dust covered the shelves as though nobody had entered the building for years. A faded newspaper near the register contained an article about the disappearance of Walter Griggs from 1987. The old man who warned me should not have been alive. I left Appalachia that same day and never returned to those mountains again. For months afterward, I suffered nightmares about tunnels beneath the earth, filled with whispering voices calling my name. Sometimes I woke believing muddy footprints surrounded my bed despite living alone in a third-floor apartment. Therapists told me trauma and grief created hallucinations from stress. Police dismissed my story after failing to locate the ranger station or underground chamber I described. Eventually, I forced myself to pretend none of it had ever happened because nobody would believe the truth anyway. But strange things still happen even now. Some nights I hear Ethan whispering softly from outside my apartment window, despite living 30 floors above the street. Other times my phone rings after midnight with nothing except distant breathing on the other end. Last month, I discovered muddy barefoot footprints leading across my kitchen floor toward the hallway outside my bedroom. The prints stopped directly beside my bed, exactly where someone would stand watching me sleep. I haven't slept with the lights off since that night. Sometimes, just before dawn, I hear scratching sounds coming from inside the walls of my apartment. The noises move slowly from room to room, like something crawling through the darkness, searching for me. And every single time the scratching stops, I hear Ethan's voice whisper the same horrifying sentence. You never really left the mountain. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Grave Nova Stories, and share your thoughts in the comments below. I'll see you in the next nightmare.